So this presentation reviews the main approaches and the key decisions that are on the table in the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies regarding the scope of the agreement and some of the key definitions. So first, there are broadly three key approaches that the negotiations are following in terms of scope in particular. So the first is that the new agreement will almost certainly apply to the same kinds of government expenditure as those that currently meet the definition of subsidies in Article 1 of the WTO's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So that means that the kinds of measures, the kinds of expenditure covered by this agreement will be the same as the kinds of measures covered by the existing subsidies rules. The second point, focusing very specifically on the fisheries agreement, is that the negotiations are focused on marine wild capture fishing and fishing related activities at sea. And there's two important subpoints, I think, to raise here. The first is that this means, very importantly, that subsidies to aquaculture and subsidies to inland fishing are not covered in the scope of this agreement. That's broadly the understanding negotiators are working with. The second, you might be wondering what's meant by fishing related activities at sea. So generally, the definition of fishing related activities that's found in the Port State Measures Agreement, which was, has been adopted by a number of WTO members, but not all. So that definition is being used as the basis for this negotiation. So in the Port State Measures Agreement, fishing related activities includes things like the processing of fish as well as servicing of fishing vessels. So what that means in this context is that subsidies to vessels that collect and process fish at sea and subsidies to refueling or other service vessels that service fishing vessels at sea, subsidies to those activities could also fall within the scope of this agreement. And the last point here is that the description of illegal, unreported and unregulated, that's the IUU, the description of those activities that are found in paragraph 3 of the International Plan of Action on IUU, which was adopted by consensus by all members of the FAO in 2001. That description in paragraph 3 is what's being used as the basis of negotiation and the understanding of what IUU fishing consists of in the context of these negotiations. And what's important to know, I think, about the description in the IPOA is that it describes the kinds of activities that can be considered illegal or unreported or unregulated fishing. But what actually counts as illegal fishing, for example, depends on the rules that govern the fishing where it takes place. So that means that the content of the definition is established by national laws and regulations or international rules, such as those established under a regional fisheries management organisation that a government may be a party to. So those are sort of four key approaches that seem to be the basis of the negotiation so far. So key decisions that still remain to be made under scope and definitions. The first is whether some kinds of subsidies should be excluded from the scope of the entire agreement, or whether they should be listed as exemptions from particular rules within the agreement if they're excluded at all. So some kinds of subsidies that members have proposed be excluded either from the scope or from specific disciplines include subsidies in particular situations, so subsidies to support fisheries after natural or man-made disasters, subsidies for kinds of fishing, so in particular for small-scale fishing, subsidies for recreational fishing, and subsidies for fishing in particular geographical areas, for example, for fishing in a member's territorial sea. And the territorial sea, as a reminder, is a relatively narrow band of water 12 nautical miles from a member's coast. So those are all suggestions members have made to exclude from the scope of the agreement entirely particular kinds of subsidies. Now, exemptions from scope, of course, carve those subsidies out of all of the proposed disciplines, as opposed to just one specific rule. That's the key thing to bear in mind. Now, the choice as to whether a subsidy is excluded from scope or is excluded just from, or is made an exception from one rule, makes a difference when the agreement comes to be implemented, and in particular if a subsidy is ever challenged. So if a kind of subsidy is carved out of the scope of the agreement completely, that subsidy to be challenged, if that subsidy were challenged, a complainant would have to show that that subsidy fit within the scope of the agreement, right? It would have to prove that it was actually within the scope of the rules. But if a subsidy is listed as an exception to a rule, then it's for the defendant, the country providing the subsidy, to prove that the exception applies. So there's the choice of whether to carve it out of scope or to make it an exception makes a difference in terms of how the agreement can be enforced. The second big decision under scope and definitions is whether non-specific fuel subsidies should also be covered in the scope of the agreement. And the idea here is to capture fuel subsidies that might be provided across economies, including the fishing sector. So if we begin on the basis that the agreement covers subsidies as defined in the current WTO agreements, and that those are and we include as a general rule a specificity requirement, there's a particular proposal to include fuel subsidies that may not meet the specificity requirement, that may be provided horizontally. So the third key decision also relates to fuel, and that's whether fuel detaxation schemes, so that's a particular form of fuel subsidy that's provided by both developed and developing countries, whether that specific kind of subsidy should be explicitly excluded from the scope of the agreement. Now, all three of these decisions and ideas have been controversial. And the fuel question in particular is controversial in large part because fishing is a very fuel-intensive activity, and fuel subsidies are provided by many members in many different forms. Not only is fuel sensitive, but it's an important question from the perspective of the effectiveness of the agreement. Because fuel is one of the subsidies that is most likely to increase fishing effort. So the degree to which it's included or excluded in the rules could potentially make quite a big difference to how effective the overall agreement is.